This is the bond before any secrets.
For 32 years, he called him brother. They shared a childhood, inside jokes, family dinners, summer vacations, late-night conversations about their dreams and fears. They borrowed each other's clothes without asking. They fought the way brothers do, hard and fast and then forgotten within hours. They supported each other through relationships that ended badly, through job changes and disappointments, through the ordinary struggles that everyone faces when they're trying to figure out who they are and what they want from life. Marcus and David Harrison were brothers in every way that mattered, or so they thought. But one ordinary Tuesday morning in March, sitting alone in his apartment, staring at a computer screen, Marcus discovered something that would destroy everything he thought he knew about his own identity, about his family, about the very foundation of his existence on this earth. Marcus sat in his apartment on that Tuesday morning, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the coffee mug beside him. For 32 years, he believed his life had a simple story. He had a father named Robert. He had a brother named David, 3 years younger. He had a mother named Susan, who held the family together through thick and thin. But in that single moment, everything he thought he knew about himself, about his identity, about the very foundation of who he was as a human being, came crashing down with the force of an avalanche. The DNA results on his screen told him something that should have been impossible, something that didn't make any logical sense. And yet, there it was, in black and white letters on the bright screen. The words seemed to mock him, to laugh at him for being so blind for so many years. He read them again, then again, and again. His throat tightened, his stomach twisted, and he felt that sickening sensation of your entire world tilting beneath your feet, knowing that nothing would ever be the same from this moment forward. To understand what came next, you need to understand who these people were before the secret consumed them. Robert Harrison was born in 1951 in Columbus, Ohio. He was the son of a steel mill worker and a nurse. He grew up in a modest home on the east side of the city, the kind of neighborhood where everybody knew everybody else's business, where children played in the streets until the sun went down, where families gathered on front porches during summer evenings and talked about their lives. Robert was quiet as a child. He wasn't the loud, outgoing type. He was the kind of boy who preferred to read in the library, who got good grades without much effort, who helped his mother with the dishes without being asked. By the time he was in high school, Robert had developed a reputation as a reliable, steady person. Not flashy, not attention-seeking, just solid and dependable. He was the kind of friend who showed up when he said he would. He was the kind of son who made his parents proud through consistent effort and moral character. His friends respected him, even if they didn't necessarily seek him out for wild adventures. Robert married Susan Mitchell in 1980 at the age of 29. Susan was a teacher's aide, a warm and nurturing woman with auburn hair and eyes that seemed to hold infinite kindness. She came from an even more modest background than Robert, growing up in a single-parent household with her mother working double shifts just to keep food on the table. Susan carried with her a deep desire to create stability, to build a family, to have children, and give them the kind of secure, loving home that she never had growing up. By all accounts, it was a good marriage. Robert and Susan were devoted to each other. They attended church on Sundays. They saved their money carefully. They talked about the future, about the children they wanted to have, about building a life together in a quiet, unremarkable way that would be the envy of anyone who valued peace and reliability. In 1982, their son Marcus was born. The pregnancy was normal, the delivery was uncomplicated, and the infant appeared to be perfectly healthy. Robert held his newborn son in the hospital room and wept with joy. This was what he wanted. This was what his entire life had been leading toward. Someone to love, someone to guide, someone to pass on his values to, someone who would carry his name forward. 3 years later, in 1985, their second son David was born. The family was complete, or so they believed. Robert now had 2 sons. Susan had fulfilled her dream of being a mother. They had a small house in a quiet neighborhood. Robert worked as an insurance adjuster. Susan continued her work at the school. Their life was ordinary in the most beautiful way possible. There were birthday parties and school plays. There were summers at the lake and Christmases with extended family. There were homework sessions at the kitchen table and conversations about dreams and ambitions. Marcus grew up watching his father, learning from him, trying to model himself after Robert's quiet strength and moral consistency. David, the younger brother, was more outgoing than Marcus, more willing to take risks, more likely to challenge authority in small ways. but both boys adored their father. Both boys felt secure in the love of their parents. Both boys grew up believing they knew exactly who they were and where they came from. No doubts, no questions, no cracks in the foundation. The years passed in the way they always do. Childhood became adolescence. Adolescence became young adulthood. Marcus went to college, studied business, came back home for holidays. David went to college as well, studied engineering, moved to another state for a job opportunity. They maintained their relationship as brothers the way many siblings do. They called occasionally. They visited for major holidays. They maintained the bond that had been formed over those first 18 years of living in the same house, breathing the same air, part of the same nuclear unit. If anything seemed off during these years, Marcus never explicitly addressed it. There were small things, perhaps. Moments where his father's mood seemed to shift when certain topics came up. Moments where his mother's eyes seemed to hold something unspoken. Moments where conversations would abruptly change direction when Marcus or David wandered into a particular room. But nothing so obvious, so blatant, so impossible to ignore that either son felt compelled to ask direct questions. This is the human capacity for selective blindness. We see what we want to see. We believe what we want to believe. We live within the narratives we've been handed, even when small inconsistencies gnaw at us beneath the surface. Robert aged. His hair turned gray, then white. He retired from his insurance job. He spent more time in his garage, working on small projects, fixing things around the house. He was still quiet, still reserved, still the man his sons had always known. But there was something else too, something that perhaps only became obvious in retrospect. There was a distance, not cruelty, never that. Robert was never a cruel man, but a certain emotional reserve that Marcus, in his younger years, attributed to his father's personality type rather than to any deeper cause. Susan remained warm and loving throughout. She seemed to carry a sadness with her, the kind of sadness that never quite lifted, the kind of sadness that might come from living a life that wasn't quite what you'd hoped it would be, but that you were committed to making work anyway. She doted on her sons. She made sure they knew she loved them completely. She was present for every important moment in their lives. And yet, there was this undercurrent, this sense of weight, this burden that she carried silently year after year. By the time Marcus was in his 30s, he had built a career, had relationships that came and went, had begun to live his own independent life. He thought of his parents less frequently. He was absorbed in his own world, his own concerns, his own future. This is normal. This is what happens when people grow up and move away. The family of origin becomes less central to daily existence. The mysteries of that family, if they're not pressing, tend to fade into the background noise of life. But in 2022, something changed. Marcus's mother, Susan, became ill. Nothing catastrophic at first, just the usual markers of aging. But it was enough to make Marcus think more carefully about his parents, about the passage of time, about the stories they carried and might never share. He visited home more frequently. He sat with his mother while she recovered, and in these quiet moments, he found himself more curious about their lives, about their history, about the choices they'd made and why. In January 2023, Marcus received a promotional email about an ancestry DNA testing kit. It was the kind of thing thousands of people receive every single day. A simple email from one of those genealogy services offering a discount on a DNA test that would allegedly tell you where your ancestors came from, what percentage of different ethnicities you carried in your blood, what countries your family originated from. Most people delete these emails without a second thought. Marcus almost did the same, but something made him pause. Perhaps it was the visit with his mother. Perhaps it was the awareness that time was passing, that his parents wouldn't be around forever, and that this might be an opportunity to learn something concrete about his family's origins. He purchased the kit. He collected his DNA sample. He sent it in. It was a casual action, really. Nothing momentous. Nothing that suggested it would become the catalyst for the unraveling of his entire world. The results came back in early March. Marcus received the email notification on a Tuesday morning. The kit had mapped his ancestry, showing him the geographic regions where his ancestors had lived, the ethnic breakdown of his heritage, the percentage of different populations that flowed through his bloodline, and then, as an additional feature, it showed him DNA matches. Other people who had also taken the test, other people who shared DNA with him, other people who were ostensibly his cousins or distant relatives. This feature was designed to be fun, a way to expand your sense of family, to connect with people you might never have known existed. But as Marcus scrolled through the list of matches, he noticed something that caught his attention. There was a person listed with the surname Harrison, the same surname as his father's birth family. According to the system, this person shared a significant percentage of DNA with him. The match was listed as close family. Marcus noted the name and moved on. He didn't think too much about it. Family DNA matches could mean many things. It could be a cousin. It could be a distant relative he'd never heard of. It was interesting, but not alarming. But then, a few days later, Marcus noticed something else. Another match appeared in his results. This match was a person named Sarah Chen. According to the DNA matching algorithm, Sarah Chen was his half-sister. The word half was there in black and white. Marcus stared at this for a long time. He had no half-sister. He had no siblings that he didn't know about. He had a brother, David, and as far as he knew, David was his full brother, sharing both parents. There was no half-sister in the equation. This had to be an error. DNA testing companies made mistakes sometimes. Their algorithms weren't perfect. Perhaps this was just a glitch, something that would be corrected if he waited long enough, or if he ignored it. Marcus reached out to Sarah Chen through the DNA matching service's messaging system. He explained that he believed there might be an error in the results, that she was probably matched to him as a cousin or more distant relative, not a half-sister. Sarah responded quickly. She was polite and straightforward. She said that she had taken the DNA test years ago and that she had confirmed her relationship to Marcus through one of the genealogists who worked with the testing company. She said she was very confident in the results. She said she had a half-brother named David who had also confirmed the connection through DNA testing. Marcus's hands felt cold when he read this message. David? His brother David? She was claiming to be related to David as well? But that made no sense. If Sarah was somehow David's half-sister, then by definition she should be Marcus's half-sister as well, which is what the DNA results were telling him. Unless something was very wrong with the story he'd been told about his own family. For 3 days, Marcus didn't contact anyone. He sat with this information, turning it over in his mind, looking for explanations that would make sense. Perhaps his mother had a child before she was married to his father. Perhaps there was an older sibling somewhere that the family had never discussed. Perhaps David was his half-brother, not his full brother, and his parents had simply never told him about that fact. But even as these explanations formed in his mind, he knew they were unlikely. His parents weren't secretive people. They were straightforward. They were honest. If there was a half-sibling somewhere, they would have mentioned it at some point. They would have explained it. They wouldn't have simply hidden it for his entire life. On the 4th day, Marcus called David. His brother answered on the 2nd ring. Marcus's voice shook as he said, "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you taken a DNA test? From one of those ancestry services?" There was a long pause on the other end of the phone. When David finally spoke, his voice sounded different. It sounded tense. It sounded like the voice of someone who had been waiting for this exact phone call for a long time. "Yes," David said. "I took a test about 6 months ago." "Why are you asking?" Marcus took a deep breath. "I just took one too, and something weird came up. The results are saying that I have a half-sister, and they're saying that you do too. Her name is Sarah Chen. Do you know who she is?" Another pause. And then David said something that would start the avalanche that neither of them could have anticipated. "I need to talk to Dad." Marcus didn't want to wait. He wanted answers immediately, but David insisted that they needed to go to their father first, that they needed to ask him directly, that David had taken his DNA test because he had his own questions, his own doubts that had been building for years. David asked Marcus not to tell their mother yet. He asked Marcus to keep this between the two of them until they had a chance to speak with Robert. Marcus reluctantly agreed, though the weight of keeping this secret, even for a few days, felt unbearable. A week later, Marcus and David were sitting in their father's living room. Robert was 72 years old now, his hair completely white, his face lined with age. Susan was visiting her sister that day, which was why they'd chosen this time. Robert seemed confused at first, when his sons asked him to sit down, when they asked him to talk about family history, when they brought up the DNA test results. He asked them what this was about. And then David, the younger son, the one with more courage to be direct, said the words that would shatter everything. "Dad, I need you to tell us the truth. The DNA test is showing that Marcus and I might not be full brothers, and it's showing that I have a half-sister I've never met. What's going on?" Robert's face went white, literally white. The color drained from his face as if someone had pulled a plug and let all his blood run out. He didn't speak for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. And then he said something that Marcus would replay in his mind hundreds of times. I was wondering when this would come out. Not if, not whether, when. As if he'd been waiting. As if he'd known that eventually, technology would catch up with his secrets, that DNA wouldn't lie the way people could, that the past would eventually demand to be acknowledged. Robert told them to sit down, and then he told them a story that he said he had been keeping for 32 years. He told them that David was not his biological son, that David was the biological son of his brother Thomas, that Thomas had had an affair with Susan before Robert and Susan were married, that when Susan became pregnant, she didn't know who the father was, that Robert had made the decision to marry her anyway, to raise David as his own, to never tell David the truth because he loved Susan, and he loved the boy, and he didn't want to destroy either of their lives with information that would only cause pain. Robert's voice cracked when he talked about this. Tears ran down his face. He said he had loved David with everything in his heart. He said David was his son in every way that mattered except biologically. He said that Thomas had agreed to the arrangement, that Thomas had stayed away, that Thomas had never tried to claim David or interfere in any way. He said that Marcus was his biological son, that Marcus had been born within the marriage, that Marcus was the product of his own flesh and blood with Susan. He said he hoped they could understand why he had made the choice to keep this secret. He said he hoped they could forgive him. But what Robert hadn't known was that the DNA test had revealed more than just David's true paternity. It had revealed the existence of Sarah Chen, Thomas's biological daughter from another relationship. And more importantly, it was about to reveal something that would make everything even more complicated than any of them could have imagined. After the conversation with their father, Marcus and David left in a state of shock. They sat in Marcus's car in their father's driveway, not speaking, barely breathing, trying to process what they had just learned. David had spent his entire life believing one thing, only to discover that it was false. Marcus had spent his entire life believing his father was his father, but now he was processing the reality that his brother was actually his uncle's son. The concept of brother had become something more complicated. The bond between them, which had always felt straightforward, now carried layers of complexity that neither of them was prepared to untangle. But then David said something that Marcus hadn't expected. There's more. Something else came up in my DNA results. I didn't tell Dad about this. Marcus looked at his brother. What? David took out his phone and showed Marcus the DNA analysis. According to the results, there was a person listed who was David's full sibling, not a half-sibling. A full sibling, sharing 100% of his DNA, or nearly so. This person had the surname Richardson and a first name that Marcus recognized immediately, because that name belonged to someone Robert had mentioned, someone Robert had said was involved in this situation from the very beginning. This person was Thomas's wife. No, not his wife. This person was Thomas himself. The DNA results were showing that David and Thomas had the same father, which meant that Thomas and Robert were not full brothers. They were half-brothers, which meant that the entire family structure that Robert had described was somehow different from what he'd explained. The pieces didn't fit together in the way they were supposed to. Marcus and David called their father back immediately. When Robert answered, his voice was exhausted, empty, like someone who had given everything he had and had nothing left to give. David said, "Dad, we need to know more about Uncle Thomas. We need to know the whole story, because the DNA results don't match up with what you told us." And Robert, defeated, broken by the weight of a secret he'd carried for 3 decades, finally told them the entire truth. The truth was this: Robert and Thomas were indeed half-brothers, sharing the same mother but having different fathers. This fact had always been part of the family narrative, nothing hidden about it. But what Robert had not told them was that Thomas's circumstances in life had been significantly different from his own. Thomas had struggled with stability. He'd had difficulties finding consistent work. He'd had relationship problems. He'd made mistakes. And, at a point in his life when he was particularly unstable, he had had a brief affair with Susan before Susan was even married to Robert. When the affair ended, Susan had moved on. She had become involved with Robert. She had married Robert. And then she became pregnant, and she wasn't entirely sure who the father was. The DNA test had now revealed that Thomas was definitely the biological father of David. But it had also revealed that Thomas and David shared the same percentage of DNA that you would expect from a direct parent-child relationship, confirming what the math suggested. David was Thomas's biological son, but here's where it becomes even more complicated. Thomas, according to the DNA results and according to the extended family connections that David and Marcus had discovered, had other children, including a full sister to David who had taken a DNA test years ago, which meant that David's entire biological family extended further than any of them had known. It meant that David had siblings he'd never met. It meant that the biological family that had been hidden from him for 32 years was now suddenly accessible, real, demanding acknowledgement. Marcus realized in that moment that his brother for his entire life was actually his first cousin by blood, his uncle's son, the person he had grown up with, had shared secrets with, had looked up to and looked out for, was technically his cousin, but emotionally, he was still his brother. Biology didn't change that. DNA didn't change that. What changed was Marcus's understanding of the family story. What changed was the narrative he'd been living within. In the weeks that followed, Marcus and David had to decide what to do with this information. They had to decide whether to tell their mother, who apparently had not been part of the original decision to keep David in the dark. They had to decide whether to reach out to their biological uncle Thomas and explain what had happened. They had to decide whether to maintain relationships with the biological siblings that David had discovered through the DNA matching system. They had to decide how to move forward as a family when the foundation of that family had been revealed to be built on deception, however well-intentioned that deception might have been. Their mother Susan was devastated when they finally told her, but her devastation was different from what Marcus and David had expected. She wasn't angry at Robert for keeping the secret. She wasn't defensive about her own role in the situation. Instead, she seemed to be relieved that it was finally out in the open. She had been carrying this burden for 32 years. She had been living with the weight of knowing that her son didn't know the truth about himself. She had been watching Robert carry this same burden. And now, finally, they could stop pretending. Susan explained her version of events to her sons. She described the period in her life when she was young and uncertain, when she had been with Thomas before Robert, when that relationship had ended, and when Robert had stepped in and loved her completely anyway. She described the fear she had felt when she realized she was pregnant and didn't know who the father was. She described the conversation with Robert, where he had told her that it didn't matter, that he would raise the child as his own, that his love for her was bigger than the biological facts of paternity. She described the decision to never tell David, made in consultation with both Robert and Thomas, who had agreed that it was better for everyone if the secret remained hidden. She explained that she had lived with the guilt of that decision every single day. Every time David achieved something, every time he celebrated a birthday, every time he looked at Robert with love and trust, Susan had felt the weight of the lie pressing down on her. She had wanted to tell him, but she had been bound by the agreement she'd made with Robert and Thomas, bound by the fear of what the truth would do to her son. Thomas was contacted by Robert in a phone call that took place after the family conversation. Robert told his half-brother that the secret was out, that David knew the truth, that there was no point in continuing to pretend. Thomas was now 70 years old. He had lived his own life, had his own family, had never publicly acknowledged his biological son, but had apparently paid some level of financial support over the years, according to an agreement he'd made with Robert decades ago. Thomas's response, according to Robert's report, was one of sadness and acceptance. He said he had hoped the secret could be kept forever. He said he understood why Robert had made the choices he'd made. He said he was sorry for the pain that his affair with Susan had caused, and he said he would be willing to meet David if David wanted that. 6 weeks after the revelation, David made the decision to meet his biological father. Marcus came along for support. They drove to a restaurant in a neutral city, halfway between where Thomas lived and where David lived. Marcus felt strangely nervous as they walked into the restaurant, as if he was about to meet someone important, which of course he was, though not in the way he'd expected. Thomas was already sitting at the table when they arrived. He was an older man, with white hair and a lined face, but there was something in his features that made Marcus look twice. Because Thomas had some of the same features that David had, the same nose, the same shape of the face, the same small scar on his forehead that David had gotten as a child, and that had never fully gone away. Biology was written all over both of them in ways that were impossible to deny now that Marcus knew what to look for. Thomas stood when he saw David and Marcus approaching the table. He looked at David for a long moment without speaking, and then tears started running down his face. He said, "I've been waiting 32 years to meet you. I've watched you grow up from a distance, without you knowing it was me watching. And every moment of that has been the hardest thing I've ever done." David was crying too. Marcus was crying. 3 men sitting in a restaurant crying, while other diners ate their meals and checked their phones, completely unaware that they were witnessing a moment of profound emotional significance. Thomas began to tell David the story from his perspective. He talked about his relationship with Susan, about the end of that relationship, about learning that he was going to be a father, about the decision that Robert and he had made together. He talked about the years of watching from a distance as his son grew up with another man's last name. He talked about the pride he felt in David's accomplishments, even though he couldn't openly acknowledge that pride. He talked about the guilt he carried for his role in creating a situation that required such a profound deception. David asked his biological father questions about his life, about his other children, about the family that David now belonged to in a biological sense. Thomas answered these questions honestly, describing his own struggles, his own failures, as a father to his other children, his regrets, his attempts to do better in the years since the early chaos of his life. It became clear to both David and Marcus that Thomas was not a villain in this story. He was not someone who had seduced an innocent woman and then abandoned her. He was someone who had been young, who had made a mistake, and who had done his best to accept the consequences of that mistake by agreeing to the plan that Robert had proposed. He had lived a life of restraint, of sacrifice, never truly claiming his biological son because he understood that Robert was the real father in every way that mattered. By the end of that first meeting, David had made a decision. He told Thomas that he understood why the secret had been kept. He told Thomas that he wasn't angry at him. He told Thomas that he had grown up loved and secure, and that whatever confusion or pain he felt now about the truth, it paled in comparison to the gift Robert had given him by choosing to raise him as his own. And he told Thomas that going forward, he wanted to develop a relationship with him, not to replace Robert, never to replace Robert, but to acknowledge the biological reality that they were father and son, and to see if there was a way for them to develop a real relationship based on that biological fact. Thomas wept when David said this. He said that it was more than he had ever hoped for. In the months that followed, David began to get to know his biological family. He met his half-siblings, the children that Thomas had with other women. He learned about his extended biological family, people he had never met, but who now felt connected to him through the simple fact of shared DNA. He learned their stories, their struggles, their hopes. He discovered that he had nieces and nephews he didn't know existed. He discovered that there was an entire branch of his family tree that had been hidden from him, not out of malice, but out of an attempt to protect him from complicated truths. Meanwhile, Marcus had to renegotiate his relationship with his brother. The word brother still felt right to him, even though he now knew that technically, David was his cousin. But the nature of the relationship had shifted in Marcus's mind. Where once it had felt simple, now it felt complex. Where once it had been based on the assumption of shared parentage, now it was based on shared childhood and chosen relationship rather than biological fact. Susan and Robert had to navigate the aftermath of the revelation as well. Robert was struggling with the fact that his carefully maintained secret had unraveled. He felt that he had failed to protect his family from the truth, even though intellectually he understood that DNA testing was inevitable, that secrets were always eventually exposed, that he had done his best given the circumstances of his time and his generation. Susan seemed to experience something like relief mixed with sadness. She was glad that the secret was finally out, that she didn't have to carry that burden anymore. But she was also sad that her deception, even though it was born from a desire to protect David, had caused this disruption in the family. She spent time with David, talking about the years she had lived with the knowledge that he didn't have, trying to help him process the information. Thomas died just 14 months after that first meeting with David. He had been ill for some time, apparently, and the revelation of his true relationship with David seemed to have both energized him and exhausted him emotionally. His death meant that David only had a year and 2 months to develop a relationship with his biological father, but in that time, they spoke regularly. They met several more times. Thomas told David stories about his life, about David's other siblings, about the family history that David was now part of. Thomas told David that he was grateful to Robert, that he had always been grateful to Robert for stepping in and doing the right thing, even though it had meant sacrificing a relationship with his own son. Thomas told David that his life had been hard, that he had made many mistakes, but that he had one great regret, that he had not been able to be a father to David in the way that he had wanted to be. Today, Marcus and David still consider each other brothers. They still call each other brother when they talk. The biological reality that they are cousins by blood has not changed the emotional reality that they are brothers by choice and by experience. They grew up together. They shared the same childhood. They lived in the same house with the same two people who raised them. That bond is deeper than DNA, and both of them understand that now in a way they didn't before. David maintains a relationship with his extended biological family. He sees them regularly. He attends family gatherings, but he also maintains his relationship with Robert as his father. Robert is his father. That fact is not changed by the biological revelation. If anything, it is reinforced by it. Because Robert chose to be David's father. Robert chose to love David, knowing that David was not his biological son. Robert chose to raise David as his own, to give David his name, to give David his stability and his values. That is a deeper form of paternity than mere biology could ever be. Marcus has had to renegotiate his sense of self in light of these revelations. He is still Robert's biological son, but now he understands his father in a different way. He understands the sacrifices Robert made. He understands the burden Robert carried. He understands the difficult choice Robert faced when he was young, when he learned that the woman he loved was pregnant with another man's child, and he decided that his love for her was more important than his biological imperative. Marcus has also developed a relationship with Thomas's memory, and with the biological family that he shares through his half-uncle's bloodline. He has met his extended cousins. He has attended family gatherings. He has learned the stories of the family that was hidden from him. Susan is still alive today. She is 87 years old, and she carries both the sadness and the relief of finally having her secret revealed. She has said that she wishes she could have told David the truth years ago, that she wishes she didn't have to live so long in the shadow of that deception. But she has also said that she understands why she made the choice she did, that she was doing the best she could with the information and the understanding that she had at the time. She has said that she is grateful that David has been able to develop a relationship with his biological family, and that she is grateful that the entire family has been able to move forward in a more honest way. The story of Marcus and David is not a story of villains and victims. It is not a story where someone did something terribly wrong and someone else suffered terribly as a result. It is a story where people made difficult choices in difficult circumstances, where those choices had consequences that lasted for decades, where technology eventually exposed the secrets that people had tried desperately to keep hidden. It is a story about what family really means when you strip away the biological definitions and look at the actual relationships between people. It is a story about love and sacrifice, and the ways that family bonds can survive the revelation of uncomfortable truths. As you listen to this story, you might be wondering what you would do in Robert's position. You might be wondering whether you would have kept the secret that he kept. You might be wondering whether you would have had the courage to love someone else's child as your own, to commit to raising that child, to never mention the biological truth, to carry that secret for 32 years. The answer to that question says something about who you are as a person. Some people would have insisted on honesty from the beginning. Some people would have suggested that David deserved to know the truth about his parentage, that it was his right to understand his own biological heritage. Some people might argue that Robert was wrong to keep the secret, that deception is always harmful, that children have the right to know the truth about their origins. But here's the counter-argument that Robert and Susan and Thomas would make. Sometimes, the truth causes more pain than the deception. Sometimes, protecting someone you love from information that will only hurt them is an act of mercy rather than an act of deception. Sometimes, the love you have for a person is more important than the biological facts of your relationship to that person. These are the kinds of moral questions that have no easy answers. These are the kinds of dilemmas that have torn families apart throughout history. These are the kinds of secrets that weigh on the conscience of the people who keep them, but that are kept anyway, because the alternative seems worse. In the end, what the story of Marcus and David teaches us is that family is defined not by biology, but by the choices we make, the relationships we commit to, and the love we demonstrate through action over time. Robert was David's father because he chose to be. Thomas was David's biological father, but that biological fact didn't make him a father in the way that Robert was. Family is not something that is determined at conception. Family is something that is built through daily interaction, through showing up for each other, through sacrificing for each other, through maintaining commitment even when things are difficult. Marcus and David are brothers because they were raised together, because they shared a childhood, because they made the choice to maintain their relationship even after discovering the biological complication. That is what makes them brothers. That is what family really means.